Still walking in. All right, we're good? Yeah. All right. Hello. Welcome to Indie Comics Creator Con, the convention for creators, by creators. My name is Jamie Jones. I'm a cartoonist, and I am the program director for this show, which is wild. That's a weird thing that's happened. This year, we took a stance to make panels that mean something, topics that could lead to actionable advice for creators new and old. So this panel is the panel that I have an agenda for. You do enough interviews and you're answering the same questions every time. Guiding an interview is tough. Preparing questions that can lead to interesting and unexpected conversations can set you apart. Anthony Composto and Manny Gomez are two comics journalists striving to ask better questions. So let's start this thing off with a softball question. Quickly warm it up, ramp this up. What makes a successful interview for both of you?
That's a softball?
Yeah, that's a softball question, yeah. This is the type of thing we're trying to do at IC3.
Right. So
softball questions.
No, I got a great answer for that, actually. To me, a winning interview, I got this from Matt Sardo, who's putting this whole thing on. If I can get the person to say, that's a good question, that's like, to me, that's like a winning, right there, I'm in the lead. And I can like kind of relax on it a little bit. You want to like make them, or like, oh, I haven't been asked that before. Like, you want to kind of be different. You kind of want to, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
no,
that's good. And like, I feel like when you're interviewing a creator, like, even though you might be interviewing them about a specific project, it's like the interview is going to be twofold because you want to get. You want to get what the project is about, but you also want to get to the root of who the creator is at the same time. And like, sometimes that's kind of a balancing act because it's real easy to ask specific questions about a specific project that they're working on. But I think it's a little more difficult to get the creator to open up about themselves too.
I think going off that too, as far as successfulness goes, the project that they're working on, a lot of times you're doing an interview to promote a specific.
Correct, yeah.
So you want to make sure that you're asking questions that are getting to the root of things that are being interesting for the reader, but also the person's trying to promote their work. They want to make sure that people know what's coming out, what they're doing, what it's about, and they want to buy the work. So that's success to me, is like getting the premise across, getting what people are trying to sell across, and hopefully making it sound appealing to the reader or the listener or however they're taking in the interview.
Because I feel like when you're doing the interview, you got to create an engagement for three people: the subject, the reader, and even yourself. Because I feel like if you don't nail all those three things, it's going to come off as a little boring. You may come off as boring in the questions, they may come off as boring in their response, or the project might not even come through. So it's a tight balancing act because I think you've got to be as invested in the interview as the subject is. So you've got to sort of do a little research, I think, too.
Ton of research.
Yeah,
Ton of research.
Even simple like going through and reading interviews with whoever you're interviewing to make sure that you're not asking them the same question like you said that 30 people have asked them. Like we're talking comics, so obviously if you're interviewing a comic creator, they're gonna love comics. So like they probably gonna ask 1,000 times, "What's your favorite comic?" And like,
how did you get into comics?
Exactly. And most of us have an answer for that, but I mean, it's also been asked a million times.
The preparation is key.
Yes.
You read or watch a lot of interviews from the person. What have they been asked before? What do they respond well to? What do they not respond well to? Yeah, preparation is key.
And for me, I since I was a kid, I've always loved reading interviews. It's one of my favorite things to read. I think like a good interview is going to engage you, whether you know anything about the subject, whether you know anything about the project you're working on. It's it's going to captivate you. And the best interviews also work more like conversations, I think, than actual just sitting there and asking questions.
So a little bit more to the agenda, my agenda thing.
Okay, yeah.
So the vernacular that is used when talking about comics tends to go a lot of ways into other mediums.
Correct,
other
yeah.
things, right? We talk about film, we talk about literature, we talk about whatever we can to kind of grasp onto a specific topic. What do you think, should we try to develop a language that uses comics that is universal and can be, So I have answered the exact same question 50 times, but it's asked very differently just because of the verbiage is different.
Right. Yeah. I was looking forward to this because I know this is what you really wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
We had a lot of personal discussions about this stuff, and it depends on who I'm interviewing as well, and I try not to get hung up on vernacular too much. To me, it's a matter of, like, as long as the point is getting across, as long as they understand what I'm asking them or we understand what we're talking about, like, that's important to me. As far as the language of it goes, I think there's some overlap with film. There's not a camera, obviously, as Jamie likes to say, there's not a camera involved. You're not panning the camera or anything like that, but there is overlap in terms of, like, overhead shot, POV shot, like, different ways to frame something. So I think the language of comics. So, like, that was actually something I wanted to bring up in this. Like, where do you draw the line as a creator who does these things? Because, like, there are certain things where it's like, if I'm reviewing a comic or interviewing a creator, and I want to talk about, like, facial expressions, the way that they're making their characters look and emotes, like, I usually defer to, like, character acting or something like that. But that seems like a very filmic term as well. Is there a better?
I think that's a performative term.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, and if you're adding the melodrama to something, right?
Okay.
Melodrama is a universal entertainment world type thing.
Yeah.
I think if you're going to compare something to character acting, I think it might be better to, like, have a specific character actor, right? With old comics specifically, like strip gag stuff, those are all based off of Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton stuff. So it's like there is a person or lineage that you're pulling from in a certain way.
So you would just refer specifically to, like, like a Chaplin or something like that?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah.
But I don't. That's what I would like as a creator. If somebody read my stuff and goes, "Oh yeah, I see what you're doing. You're
doing
a
Chaplin.
Buster Keaton thing," I would go, "Yes, please, thank you for asking that question." Yeah.
Okay. There's an overlap with film there, though, too. Now you're using film to reference, to compare your comic.
Certainly. Yeah, this is what I'm saying. It's a conversation that is ongoing, and I don't like that we have to use film terms.
Okay.
Like, we can talk about art in everything's in relation to everything. Everything's
Sure.
a conversation with everything.
Yeah.
But having specific things, like, how do you guys feel about the difference between word balloon and word bubble?
I know this is a big thing. And again, it goes back to I genuinely.
And why are you wrong, Anthony?
To me, it's a big thing. Again, if the person I'm talking to, if they understand what I use the right phrase.
Good.
It's a balloon.
It's a balloon.
Not
For
bubble.
anyone who doesn't know, it's a word balloon. It's not a word bubble.
But I do
There's
specifically-
thought bubbles. There's word balloons.
Right, yeah.
I do specifically use the correct term because I know that it ticks some people off if you don't. But my heart of hearts is also like, as long as you know what I'm talking about, that's fine. But you got to be respectful to the medium and to the people that you're talking about.
Because like you said, a thought bubble and a word balloon are two different things, and, like, in a lot of modern comics, they kind of phased out the thought bubble, if you notice, and it's been replaced by like a first-person narrative that's in a caption box, So although they're kind of serving the same, a similar objective when you're telling the story, I don't think that when you're looking at the page, it's going to achieve the same thing, Like, there's a visual component there that makes a difference.
Okay. I don't have more questions for y'all. Everyone keeps looking at me like I have the answers. I told y'all to think about stuff.
Well, we were talking about stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of interviews, so are we talking about the interviews or, like, the language of comics?
Yeah, both. Either. Whatever. We're talking good questions.
Well, good questions. Okay, so that's the key, and I do have notes. So mental prep is the most important thing. You look into the creator, you look into the thing. What is the purpose of the interview? There's a lot of factors if you're interviewing or just talking to someone. If you're just at a convention or something, or talking to an interview and you want, or a creator, and you just want to ask them some good questions about it. Are they a young creator? Are they a more experienced creator? Are they new to the scene? How much have they published? And that all kind of factors into how I ask questions. If I'm interviewing someone professionally for a work that they're promoting, if I'm able to read it in advance, I read the work and I try to tailor my questions directly to that work. And again, based on who they are, how experienced they are. Like, if it's a newer creator, how it's published as well is huge.
Yeah,
is it is it a
especially
Kickstarter
these days,
comic?
yeah.
Is it a Kickstarter comic? Is it an independent publishing thing? Is it a major big 2 publication? And I'll ask them like, done a ton of Kickstarter things, and multiple interviews is hard too. Like if you're interviewing someone after a few interviews, you don't want to ask the same questions.
I've had that happen too, and it does get harder. Like Jamie, I've interviewed you I think a couple of times, and it does get a little bit more difficult each time because like you got to find a way to keep. Like I said earlier, you got to find a way to keep the subject interested and the reader. Those are the two most important people you want to create engagement with, And in a way, your subject might be even more important because if you lose your subject's engagement, you're going to lose the reader. Like the reader's gone.
Right.
And then you're going to be left with something that nobody wants to read.
Right.
And it's just going to fall flat, and it's going to fall with no personality to it.
Yeah.
And again, that's another good point too, is personality. You do got to put a little bit of yourself into the interview, I think, when you're interviewing someone. Like, don't be afraid to be yourself when you're asking questions. Ask questions that you are genuinely interested in hearing the answer to. And I believe that you are going to get the best response from them. I always look to someone like Mark Maron, who I think is probably one of the best interviewers I've ever heard. And he really knows how to sort of engage with the subject where it goes from asking questions to becoming a conversation. I think that's the ultimate goal of every interview, is to make it become a conversation between two people, and you're going to end up with something that's going to be really good to read.
You both have worked in both print and video.
Correct, yeah.
Formats too. What are the differences and what are the hardships of both going forward? Like, are you prepping different questions for print than you are prepping for video?
I sort of do, because when you're interviewing someone live on a podcast, there's going to be a curveball. There's going to be something unexpected. You're gonna come up with a question based on something that they respond to that you didn't even think about asking beforehand. When you're doing a print interview, like, I feel like it does become a little more dry.
I ask longer questions in print.
Do you? You know what?
Yeah.
I think that I do too.
Yeah, because if I'm interviewing someone in a podcast or in a video or something like that, again, it's more conversational.
Correct, yeah.
So I don't want to be asking out a question for like 30 seconds or something. I just want to get kind of a quick question out. Whereas in print, sometimes my questions will be like 3-4 lines long, multi-questions all in one kind of thing. Because you don't have the chance to, if it's in print, you can't be bouncing back and forth.
Correct.
Either.
Yeah, you don't create that rapport with
Right.
with the subject, which I think is important.
In a video or audio interview, like I can kind of anticipate, like I'm going to ask this, and then based on what they say, I can ask A, B, and C follow-up questions. In print, you don't have that luxury, so I kind of have to try to get everything wrapped into a question all at once.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask me what a preference is, I would rather always interview people either on audio or video, even if it means transcribing it later, because I think that it just comes across as more of a conversation. Then obviously we don't always have that luxury. People don't always have the time. 9 times out of 10, they're gonna agree to like an email interview, which means that you're gonna have to do a lot more work, a lot more prep when it comes to that. And
For sure.
because you send someone an email interview and you ask a dud question, you get a one answer,
if you get an answer,
and then you've lost an entire question, which could have led to what you're asking next, and then all of a sudden the interview is just going to land with a thud,
No.
Do you go and revamp your questions to fit the flow of the...
I have before, and when I do, I always make sure to let the subject know, like, hey, I know in the email it was like this, I'm rewording it. That's another thing, is you want to be in communication with your subject, and you want to make sure that they're aware of any changes that you're making, things like that, because ultimately it's about them, not about you. You want the interview to achieve whatever goal that they're currently working on, whether it's a project they're promoting or anything like that. So
I've tweaked interviews in post, like prose ones. 'Cause sometimes I'll ask questions and I get 2 very similar responses to 2 different questions that I thought were different. I felt like I was asking 2 very distinct questions. I got 2 responses that were pretty similar. I'm like, well, I'm just going to rework this in post. I'm going to make it one question and just kind of make it one answer as well.
There's definitely when I started doing interviews, I didn't think there would be as much of an editing component as there is but there definitely is, especially in print, because like you said, after you look at it, you can kind of restructure it, and you're not changing what they said. You're just sort of, changing maybe when they said it
Right.
Yeah.
to make it flow easier.
Yeah.
I want to go to the point where you ask the same or two very different questions in your mind, and you get a similar question or a similar answer.
I hate that.
Back.
I hate when that happens.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have an example of why that happens, or what the questions were that we could
I don't have a specific.
we could now kind of dissect, being like,
Yeah.
oh, this is why this is the same question.
Yeah, I don't have an exact reference in my mind. It's usually sometimes in terms of like the backstory on a comic. I'll find something and be like, oh, why, there's this element in this comic. Like, why did you go this way? And then separately, it might be like, oh, what about this element? And then I just come to find out that it was, the basis was one and the same, more or less.
Okay.
But learning experiences. With every interview, you kind of learn to do the next one better. You
Yep.
learn what not to ask or how to ask questions better. You kind of anticipate answers better. That's the biggest thing, is just anticipating.
Yeah,
things.
and
every
you-
time I write a question, I'm just like, and this is about me because I'm a neurotic. It's just like, these are the 50 ways that they could answer this question.
Yeah. I do the same thing. You sort of think about how they may answer, and you're right. Like you've got to try and grow with each time you interview someone. You got to sort of take it as a learning. Because I go back and read the early interviews I did, and I'm embarrassed. I'm like, man, I was asking basic questions. I was like, for instance, it's simple, but you really do want to avoid yes or no questions because those are so boring. Like, like they say yes, and then, all right, so what now?
That's my number one rule.
No yes or no. No, yeah. Number one rule is no yes or no.
No
question.
one word answers.
Correct. Yeah. Don't create a question that's going to give you like one word answers, like you said.
No one word answer. Yes or no. Or like you used in the blurb about the panel, like, how many times can you ask, Dan Clowes, like, what kind of brush he uses?
Yeah.
If
Right.
you ask him, like, what brush he uses, he's going to tell you, I use this, and, like, that's the answer. Or, like, do you like this? And he'll be like, yes, I like that brush. You do, to me, it's always like a why. It's a why or a how. Why do you like this brush? How does this brush improve your work?
Exactly. There you go. Exactly.
Yeah.
Make it specific like
Exactly.
Because if you can go on Google and type like what kind of pen does Daniel Clowes use, and it pops up, you're not really asking a question that's worth asking at that point. That information is out there. So
Yeah, I'm all about getting to the root. You have
So
to-
how specific are you guys going into it? Where is the limit? Right, there's general to specific to where's that just right area?
I think it honestly depends on. It's so unique with every subject because although like there are the basic rules like not asking yes or no question, this and that. I do tend to approach each interview a little differently because each subject is going to be different. So like again, you go back on research. One big thing you want to do is if you're going to interview someone, go on and read interviews they've done, not only to see what kind of questions they've been asked, but how they answer those questions and what kind of questions they respond to. You want to know your subject to create a more engaging interview.
I like variety in terms of like the how specific to get. Again, if I'm talking about a specific work, I'll get pretty granular. I mean, I've literally screenshotted panels out of something and been like, in this panel, like I really like the way you did this. Like, why did you do this, or how did you accomplish this? So I definitely want to mix some of those in there, and then I mix more general stuff in. I do. Again, if you're trying to promote something or sell something and you want to get people to have like a general vibe of the book, I will ask like, if it's a younger creator, they haven't done a lot, influences, like, what were you trying to accomplish in this? Like, what were you pulling from in film, or like whatever other comics you're pulling from, like just to give a sense of what the tone of the work is. That way people kind of have an idea of that. I usually mix it up. I try to keep it pretty various.
Yeah. Is there any specific things that you always look for in an interview? Is there anything that you're like, I am interested in this? I'm
always interested in like the subject's interest, maybe even outside of what you're talking about, because we all bring so many things. A lot of people here are comic creators, but I'm sure you bring other influences into your creation that don't necessarily have to be about comics. And I think getting someone to answer questions about themselves makes for more engaging interview. Again, I go back to Mark Maron. He's so good at doing that. He may be interviewing a director, but he'll get to whatever movie they're promoting. But like, by the end of the interview, they might be talking about like, what their favorite record is, or like what, and honestly, I love those kind of interviews. I love reading. And I think that if you read an interview like that with a creator and you find a connection with them that's like outside of just the whatever work they're doing, I think that you're going to create a a lot more engagement, and like your readers are going to be more interested in the subject.
That's why I like doing like video or audio interviews, or like at convention interviews a lot better too, because you get that more natural flow of conversation to it. I mean, I was telling you about, like, I got to interview Jeff Darrow for Shaolin Cowboy, and it's one of my favorite interviews because of how kind of off the rails it went, just based on normal conversations. And because it was about Shaolin Cowboy, Cruel to Be Kin, this Komodo dragons involved, so I'm asking him questions about Komodo dragons and reptiles. And he's like, well, you know, when I had a pet alligator as a kid and I threw my notebook away, I'm like, let's talk about your pet alligator for 20 minutes.
There you
please.
go, yeah.
Like, this is what I want to talk about. And it's one of my favorite interviews.
And
it was nothing to do with comics. I was just like...
And when are you going to read an interview with Jeff Darrow where he's talking about his pet alligator?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, you're going to read dozens of interviews with him where he's going to talk about Shaolin Cowboy, you know?
Yeah.
And he's indirectly promoting his work anyway, because he's creating engagement with the reader by revealing a little bit about himself, you know? And who doesn't like to find out these little details about the people that we're interested in? You know, it makes them more real. You know, you want your subject to come across as like a real person, you know? And that's the way to do it, I think.
Yeah.
How much are you considering the audience when you are making the interview or setting up the questions, right? Like, if you're anticipating answers, right? If you've been doing this long enough, you're anticipating the answer. Are you trying to guide the interview in a certain way that will engage the audience a little more?
I want to... It's kind of like what you hear about comic creators or filmmakers or any kind of writer. Like, you know, the one thing that you hear a lot is that there's like, I'm writing stories, I'm drawing stories that I want to read, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I do want to make interviews, write interviews, or do interviews that are engaging to people and promote the work. But I kind of lead with, what do I want to know? Like, what is engaging to me? Again, I'm kind of hard on myself too in a lot of terms of like, I don't want to ask boring questions or repetitive questions. So like, I want to engage the person. I want to make sure that they're being asked interesting questions, that they're enjoying the interview. I want to make sure that I'm getting good answers back and things that I actually want to know about on a deeper level, and trusting that will make for a good interview for the reader or the listener in the long run, and that they'll be interested to, look into this person's work and read and listen to more interviews from me.
I mean, we're lucky in the sense that like 99% of the time, because we're interviewing people in comics and we love comics, like we're gonna be interested in the subject, you know. So I think that's one of the benefits of being in such a niche, like sort of like genre, is that like every person I've interviewed before is someone that I genuinely want to find out these things from, you know. Like even if I wasn't gonna publish the interview, I would still want to sit down and ask them these questions. Yeah. And so like to answer your question, like do I consider the audience? Yes, but like I think I sort of consider what I would want to hear first. And I think if you've done that, you're gonna grab the audience too. You know, and that's a trick. I mean, they say that's the trick about writing, right? Like you said, I mean, most creators will tell you, oh, I created this comic because I wanted to read it and no one had done it before. So approach the interview that way. Like I interviewed this person and asked these questions because I wanted to hear these answers. I was interested in what they were going to say about this.
I think it's important to have like a strong basis in like understanding comics and like knowing about comics. You know, we're both also, in addition to interviews, we review comics. Like, you know, we do analysis stuff, and having a firmer understanding of how comics work and operate leads to better questions. Yeah. Instead of just being like, you know, how is this, why is this, or whatever. Like, you know, I think about and again, this is just from years of experience of reviewing comics and reading comics and doing that kind of stuff. It leads to better questions and a better understanding. Reading books or watching materials on like the creation of comics, you know, YouTube videos, analysis videos, and learning like, you know, like that's how that is done, or this isn't how that's done, and just thinking about things in a different way. Like
and especially for me, like I'm not an artist at all. Like I can draw you a stick figure, but that's about it. You know,
it's better than I can draw.
I come as a writer, so it is. I think it is harder for like comics are a visual medium. So as someone who's not an artist, like I've learned so much just from doing the interviews, and I take that knowledge to the next interview, you know, and I take things I've learned in interviews into the analysis and vice versa, you know, kind of the same thing, because you know when you're interviewing a creator, you are sort of analyzing something anyway. You're analyzing them and you're analyzing the work, but you're doing it through questions rather than through like a review.
Manny, I will champion you as the guy who got Matt Sardo of Monkeys Fighting Robots to start doing smaller independent interviews.
Yeah,
right?
that was a goal for me. Yeah,
You came in and you were like, hey, there's this group of guys doing crazy things and making cool comics that aren't necessarily what we are always promoting, because Monkeys Fighting Robots is a big two movies review, especially at that time, right?
Yeah.
We've changed.
You've all changed a lot.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Anthony is now the editor-in-chief of Monkeys Fighting Robots, so he has...
We made some changes.
Yeah,
we took some control over
swings.
things. Yeah.
But you came in and were like, let's do that. What is it like? I mean, the difference between interviewing a guy like Jeff Darrow, who's a big established guy, and essentially going out and finding things that you find interesting and wanting to shine a light on that.
I get more excited. Definitely get more excited.
Yeah.
And I think because of my excitement, I'm going to ask better questions.
Yeah.
And they're going to come off as less than, like it shouldn't feel like work, even though it is. And there are times where I've interviewed like bigger writers that I'm still interested in, but it does feel like work because like not long ago I interviewed Matt Rosenberg for the website, and I love his work, but I'm like, this guy is always on social media, he's always, promoting his work. So I really had to sort of be like, all right, so what am I going to ask here to set it differently? With an independent creator, I think that you have a lot more leg room.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely makes it harder for
I find it easier to interview independent people.
That's
than
what
it
I'm
does.
saying.
Yeah, than
it's
it does
harder with
big two.
a big
Yeah.
two or a bigger name person.
Maybe that's just like my own anxiety and like I feel like maybe this person is more on my level or whatnot.
No, I think
but
it's what you said about Rosenberg in terms of like he's on social media constantly and they do
They're
a ton
already
of interviews.
So public, you know, like that. I think subconsciously you're gonna come at that interview differently than you would someone that's not such a public person.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. We have about 15 minutes.
Oh, really?
Do you want to ask, anybody have questions? Anybody got things to add to the conversation?
Yeah, go for it. Go
Sure.
for it.
So this is how we're going to do this. I will summarize and restate your question for the audio because these aren't projecting anything. They're just recording.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I guess my first one is more about the mechanics of, you said you would do print interviews, it sounded like primarily through email.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that, what are the logistics of that? Are you sending like an email with like 10 questions at a time? Is it more back and forth?
It depends.
So the question is, what are the logistics of sending email interviews? Are you sending 10 questions at a time? Is it one at a time? Is it kind of a back and forth?
Yeah, again, and it's going to be an annoying answer because again, it's an it depends kind of situation. You deal more than I do with self-publishing, independent stuff. I deal a little bit more with like Image, Dark Horse, Big Two kind of guys. And with like the bigger publishers, there's some more parameters. I'm usually dealing through a press rep of some kind, and it's usually like 8 to 10 questions, more or less. You can speak more to the smaller thing, but in my experience with smaller creators, there's a lot more wiggle room in terms of the number of questions of it, and you're usually emailing them directly.
I mean, print interviews I've done in various ways. I've done email interviews where I'll send, like maybe 10 to 15. I've also done them over like a chat, which I found really interesting because it's almost like a melding of like a audio interview and a print interview. And although I haven't had a lot of people that want to do them, I've actually really enjoyed those because sometimes it'll be a chat conversation that lasts an hour, but I've had some that are like over several days, and it's like, you wonder why aren't they answering right away? What are they thinking about? So it does create a different interview. So there are a couple of ways to do it, But I think for the most part, if I do an email interview, I do send all the questions at once.
Do you have like a sweet spot in terms of and it's not just because of parameters set by publishers, but I have found that like 8 to 10 questions is my sweet spot at this point, regardless of who.
If I'm approaching anything more than 12 or 13 questions, I know I got to get rid of at least 1 or 2, because the thing with interviews is that unless you're doing like a podcast episode, if it's going to be a print interview, you do want to make it somewhat short so that it gets the point across, And yeah.
You said you had additional questions?
Well, this one goes back to more about the language that you're using in describing comics and talking about them. And do you think it's because it's still not I don't want to say popular maybe, but it's not as as well known of a medium compared to film, television, theater,
Yeah.
sort of thing?
I think
All right, so going back to the, got to do it. Going to the talking about comics, the language of comics. Do you think that they are compared to these other things because it's not as well known as film, theater, music?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that people in the know, know, but even outside of that, like, depends on how deep you are into comics, not, I'm sure a lot of people here have, like, read stuff like Scott McCloud, Understanding Comics. They know a little bit more about things, but by and large, people who walk into a comic book store on Wednesdays, they might, a lot of times, movies and TV drive people to comic books these days. It's, Marvel movies and comic book movies and the TV shows that are picking up. So they're comparing them to what they've seen on the screen. So yeah, I that's what my take on it anyway.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem is that not for fans like us, but to the public at large, they think comics is a genre and not a medium. And and I think that that's something that is slowly changing. But like you said, a lot of people describe like, Captain America as a comic book movie, sure, but so is Ghost World. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like so is American Splendor. So I think a turning point is going to be when we get like the people at large to understand that comics are a medium and not a genre.
Yes.
I think that's a big distinction, and that's a big classification, right? The idea of what these interviews are pushing towards is to talk about it as a medium.
Yeah.
Right. And so
Yeah.
this is why I get hung up on using film
Yeah,
terminology, because it's another medium that we're using to
Yeah.
talk about another, like, saying something's a frame as opposed to a panel does not do the
Yeah.
same. Like, sure, they're the same thing, but
Yeah.
there is a difference in the way the language works.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Before we go back to this?
Sure.
Actually, I have two questions for you.
Oh,
I'm
no.
curious. Well, as far as the language thing goes, because you get hung up on the language, is there a term in particular that like really just grinds your gears that you wish that people had a better alternative for?
Graphic novel.
Graphic novel.
Yeah. I hate the term graphic novel. I'm a huge Will Eisner fan, and it's like my biggest gripe in the world.
That was the last thing I expected
Yeah.
to get back from that.
Yeah,
Right.
me too.
Because so in literature, in books, in prose, the distinction between what we call them, short fiction, short stories, flash fiction, novella, novel, is all based on word count and how they are, how they're presented. If you buy a novel of Conan, that is a paste up. It's a collection of a bunch of Conan short stories in one book, right? It's not just one. It's not one continual story. It's a bunch of short stories. We still call that a novel, right?
Right.
Why, in comic books, do we have a comic strip, a comic book, and a comic novel, not a comic novel, right? Why is it a graphic novel instead of a comic novel? I think when the word was being used as like the champion, the Eisner version of what a graphic novel is, that is for the separation of, for libraries and librarians to go, we don't have comic books in our library, we have graphic novels, because back in the 50s and 60s, when all of these things were happening, you had to have that separation between comic books being for children and comic books being for adults.
There's a weight to the graphic novel.
Yeah, but March won the National Book Award, right? Like I think we've transitioned past that, and we don't need to have the distinction being, because I'll tell people I'm working on a graphic novel who have no idea what a comic book is, and now I'm writing nudie comics, right? Like that's it's a word that means another thing.
Yeah.
And this is why I am so strongly
opposed to it.
opposed to it. Yeah.
My dad uses graphic novels just like for all comics at this point, and I think it's because
Right.
I think he's trying to appeal to me and like
Right.
not like offend me or something like that.
That
so
is
like
that's another huge.
I'm reading and I'm like I love the word comic and I'm all about that. So like I'm reading a comic and he's just like, oh, your graphic novel. I'm like, this is a floppy.
Yeah, and right. And so there's so many distinctions and so many classifications that have come out through comic shops, right? Like, what's a funny book versus something. My comic shop back home, my first comic shop, all children animal books, so Bugs Bunny, those are funny books. And anything that has a spine is a graphic novel. And I get in
But yeah,
loud conversation. You know my soapbox. I get on a soapbox about it.
You're on one right now.
I'm on one right now, thanks. Your wife was trying to buy me one before the show.
Soapbox she was.
But there's minor classifications that individuals end up doing to sell the comics because there is no universal language to talk about those now. I think, Linda Berry won the MacArthur Genius Grant.
Yeah.
So, she makes comics, and she will be the first person to be like, I make comics.
I feel like this has been changing, though. I don't know if anybody else feels the same about this. I feel like comics has been more and more, embraced over the years.
I think there's been a lot of creators who, and I think it has to do with coming from, the new guys that are coming into the industry, and the people that are making larger statements. Raina Telgemeier selling over 1 million copies of a comic, and then destroying the New York Times bestseller comic book list because she was on it 5 times out of 10. She comes from strip culture, right? And strip culture back in the 50s. I don't want to get into this, but the whole Frederick Wortham thing is we get to this point where it becomes comic books are for children, and the strip guys were like, we're not comic books, we're for adults. And now we have this kind of new resurgence of the graphic novels now that are coming out that are making statements, Mouse, Fun Home. These things are their lineage is coming out of comic strips and not coming out of comic books. And I think that's the difference. I think it's an artistic choice that we see things changing. Why that conversation is changing is because it's coming out of what we considered to be the adult form and not the child form.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was a good soapbox.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have time for? I do have one more question for you. I like that I flipped this entire.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah,
well,
go.
as interviewers, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're good.
We have a question over here.
Oh, that's more important. Go.
So a question I have is, how do you think the best way is to really necessarily keep the person interested and to make the interview interesting? How do you make sure your interview isn't the hundreds of others they've already had, and that your audience actually wants to pick up this interview, and your audience doesn't go, oh, I don't want to get this because I've already seen these type of answers before, or oh, these answers aren't really the best answers that I was looking for.
That's hard. That's like
so the question was how do you make sure that you ask the best question and get the audience get the audience to pick it up? Right.
Yeah, that's the hardest thing. And I've done interviews, and again, the answer is preparation and just working hard and planning it out. You can't just roll into an interview. You gotta really plan it out ahead of time. But I have put so much work into interviews, some of my favorite creators, and gotten back some of the very dry, mundane answers, and that's disappointing. But you learn from that and kind of roll forward from it. But it's preparation. You have to read a lot of interviews. You have to read a lot of comic books, and you have to kind of try to anticipate what their answers are going to be. And you think about how are they going to answer this, and all of these answers that I'm coming up with in my head aren't really that interesting. So you kind of think differently. Do you have a feeling?
I agree with everything you said. I mean, preparation is the big key. And with interviews, it's mainly reading interviews with the subject and seeing what they've been asked before, and make sure that at the very basic, I mean, there's some questions that you may have to ask that people have asked before, but you want to generally stay away. And it's not easy, especially with someone who's promoting a book. If they're promoting a book, they're going to be going to every website, every podcast, every magazine. So you're talking about you may be the 10th person to interview them on this particular subject. So you want to be very aware of what they've been asked.
And all those interviews might not be published yet either.
Correct.
So you might not know
so you might. Yeah. Yours might be the first. If you're lucky.
If you're lucky.
So yeah, it's a lot of prep work, and it takes a lot more reading than people realize. It's probably the main thing you have to do when you're going to interview is read. Yeah.
Sure. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Your question was excellent, though. So you're off to a good start, all right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Keep asking them like that, and you'll be fine.
All right. Is this it? Did we wrap it up?
I'm
Here? We've got 4 minutes.
I do have a question for you.
All right.
As interviewers, to help Manny and I.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, okay.
So, give me a question that you've been asked too many times that you wish that there was an alternative or a better way to be asked.
Okay. A better way to be asked. Because I am constantly, like, the how did you get into comics question is...
I don't think I've ever asked that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just a weird question. It's a fine question. There is, I think, or like, what was your first comic? I think the better question on that is, what was the first comic that you recognized who the creators were?
There you go. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So it's
And that
it's
goes
still
back to just going deeper.
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
It's just one step deeper, but it's also one step more personal to the creator. To go off of your point earlier, that's where I think
Yeah.
the why do you use that brush? What are you achieving when you use that thing is a better question than what kind of brush do you use?
Yeah.
Right.
So as someone who's been a subject of a bunch of interviews, do you like it when the questions get a little more personal?
I would much rather.
Okay.
Yeah.
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 Because I've always
it's so much easier.
It's hard for us, because you worry about crossing a line, not crossing a line, but you don't want to ask something that's like that they're gonna be like, oh, that's a little too intrusive or what, It's,
Yeah.
So you do like it when it gets. I mean, I'm not saying like super personal.
They're
but like,
easier to answer.
Okay.
That's a big thing. Questions that are the more specific the question, the easier it is to answer because there is a specific answer.
Yeah, I get it. Because one question that's I think everyone knows is horrible is like, where do you get your ideas from? I mean, like,
Right.
That's an example of a terrible question. Like, how do you even begin to answer that?
Yeah.
But if you go like, where did the idea for this specific project? Still bad, but a little better.
What were you reading when you came
There
up
you
with
go,
this
exactly,
idea? Right?
What-
Where's the thing that you're forming? I've been reading a lot of Iris Murdoch recently, who's just this phenomenal writer. And the ideas, I get more ideas reading basic literature than I do reading, a comic book. There's some sentence will drive somebody into, which is easier for me to answer, right? Because you're asking a very specific thing.
Yeah.
So I think the takeaway is to dig deeper.
Yeah.
I think also not being afraid to ask a question that could be very simple, right? What inspired you to do this is better than why did you make this? I think that falls into a better question. But
Yeah, I agree.
My advice is find out if they had any weird or interesting pets growing up. It doesn't have to be an alligator. It could be something less cool. But
so what was? We'll end it with this last question.
Real quick.
Oh, we'll end it with this last question.
Where do you guys think indie comics is headed in the future?
The question is, where do you think comics is headed in the future? We have 1 minute. Go.
well, we've been talking about this all weekend.
This is true.
I feel like this is all we ever talk about. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I honestly think comics are heading in the right direction for the first time in a long time, and I think it all starts with creators like that are at this con, and I think it's not only the content they're creating, but how they're creating it and how they're getting that into the hands of their readers. And what we're learning now is that like there is definitely a much easier road to connect creator with audience than there ever was before. And I think that that's slowly growing, and I think that's the future of comics is going to be that direct like relationship between a creator and his audience.
Yeah. Not to be like just too self-indulgent because we're like here at IC3, but like I think things like this are important because there's an element of it's easier than ever. Like everyone can make comics, pick up a pen, like get your comic out there, publish it online. But there's also an element of everybody's doing that now, so there's so much of it, and so much of it gets flown under the radar and missed. So having a venue like this specifically is going to help indie comics like grow and thrive. And I think there's this is going to continue to grow and expand, and I
Yeah.
think there needs to be more like this helping indie comics grow and expand.
It's the
Because-
community aspect,
Yeah.
like it's really strong right now. And I mean, it's evident by everybody that's here. You guys are all here, and you can see how full these rooms are.
Yeah.
So every year you hear that comics are dead. That's what everybody keeps saying.
Right, and that's been
they're-
happening since the
it's been happening
1900s.
since I started reading it. This is the year. It's going to be done. In the 90s, Wizard killed it all. Like, no, it just changed. Comics to me are is one art form that's continuously evolving.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to always evolve. And what comics are now are not going to be what they are in 10 years. And they're not what they were 10 years ago. And I think that's what makes it such a fantastic medium and what makes it my favorite medium.
Yeah.
And
That
it's great
constant
because
evolution.
it's great because there's no budget or anything like
Yeah,
that. I just
yeah.
said that to make Jamie's head explode. I don't believe that at all.
So yeah, there's a great book I recommended it to Anthony earlier about. It's called Sparring with Gil Kane. It's a bunch of interviews with Gil
wow,
Kane over the decades of Gil Kane's career. It starts off with him in the 60s, and comics are dying.
Yeah.
And it ends with Gil Kane in the 90s, and comics are dying. It's just, that is a thing that we say constantly. I don't know why. But comics are dying. The future of comics is good.
Maybe a certain genre within the medium of comics may be dying, but the medium itself is not.
Right,
You
yes.
And
Yeah.
I think the key is, remember, it's not a genre, it's a medium. Like any other medium that you can use to tell a narrative story, it has its own set of tools. And I know you were looking for can we define certain things? And I think it's hard because of the way that the medium evolves.
Yeah.
And and new techniques are created, new ways of creating are born all the time. Technology leads to certain things, and comics are always evolving and are always continue to evolve. And I don't think they're going to go anywhere ever. I mean, this convention is proof of that.
Yeah.
So all you guys are proof of that.
Well, we'll end with, I guess, one last final question for the audience. There's going to be, these will be put up on YouTube, so I will ask for the, comment below to the answers. What do you think independent means as a creator? And that, we're done. We're leaving. We're not answering that
We're
right
not getting
now.
into
We
it,
don't
no.
have time. But comment, email Matt Sardo about that answer because that's a good thing.
He's going to love that.
Thank you guys.
Thank you for
Thank
coming.
you guys for coming out.
The next
Right?
panel is the day one panel. It's in 30 minutes.